Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sean Quinn. I'm the Director of Regenerative Design for HOK, a global architecture, engineering, planning, and design firm. As we've noticed over the course of the past 25 years, we've seen cities become more compact, especially in the past decade, as we've seen the vast majority of the population beginning to live in cities. The pandemic taught us a couple of lessons that we learned as we all went into a remote zone. Our connections to nature, to people, were lost. We've also seen development deplete natural resources around the world. And so a conversation has started amongst our studio, amongst the architecture, engineering, and construction industry, as well as other fields of agriculture, fashion. How do we connect ourselves back to natural systems? How do we restore environments that we've depleted over the course of the past century of development? How do we engage people in a unique journey of connecting environments to people? How do we leverage development in service of nature and turning a little bit of a twist of the head instead of development using nature? How do we leverage technology in the service of that natural process? At HOK, we utilize an evidence-based design process that begins across all of our projects. It's really focused in on trying to understand with the context of our clients' goals around net zero energy, water, and waste. How do we explore the climate? How do we look at the diverse sort of circumstances by which we can organize ourselves around biome, weather patterns, and other cultural conditions of a space? How do we ensure solar access at the ground level and enable a passive solar design across a building envelope? How do we begin to look at natural ventilation and use parametric models and computational tools to optimize our building envelopes to integrate those natural systems into the built environment? By doing that, we reduce the overall loads of the building. We begin to look at natural daylight to substitute electrical lighting systems, and with that reduced target down towards net zero energy, we begin to look at opportunities to utilize smart building systems. How do we look at the best means through radiant panels to channel and collect rainwater into our systems? What are the renewable resources that we might rely on to charge our buildings? And then what's the experience like? A more important feature that we need to talk about now more than ever. What's the health and well-being of people, as well as the environment within that context? The last visual rises very quickly here, as we begin to see a building all of a sudden bloom with life on it. And it's not an easy piece of this puzzle. What does it mean to bring ecology back to the urban environment? That's what we're going to talk about over the course of the next hour. We've been studying this at HOK for about a decade, trying to understand how we could leverage existing federal office buildings owned by the General Services Administration, partnering with Metropolis Magazine to explore how we can not only achieve net zero energy, but funnel water, utilize carbon emissions within the built environment and outside of it, and sequester it within building forms. This process is really meant to feature what we call net positive impact. How do we enable a building to not continue to take from or deplete the resources of the environment, but achieve equity with it? And what we've noticed over the course of the past 15 years that we've been on this journey is that we've been able to solve many of the issues highlighted here in black or green. Some of them in black are pretty consistent ones. These are issues that evolve out of most of our clients' requests for proposals. These are the objectives and concerns we find with governmental entities, private developers, as well as communities. The number of issues have evolved in the past 5 years alone around climate change and environmental justice. Most of them, you'll notice, are about avoiding a problem, mitigating a challenge. What if we were to pivot that a little bit? And out of a very unique project that we'll begin to talk about at the end of this, a new challenge has arisen. How do we design value into every component? Looking at outputs and inputs as part of a more holistic systems thinking whole, to not look at damage being done, but also restoration that can occur. How do we achieve equity in process? As any architecture firm or engineering firm is organized, we have disciplines that are all targeted to be experts in what they do. Whether we're designing Tamar Park in Hong Kong, a wonderful open green space that allows the community to collect, or sports arenas, we leverage our individual expertise. As any problem that might emerge in design or even in automotive industry or others, we have to ask questions of other experts to reach a better answer. And it's that coordination point that we begin to term as interdisciplinary or integrated design. We begin looking at the Atlanta Falcons Stadium and the Oculus that opens up, bringing daylight down to help grow the grass and also provide a dramatic daylight experience. We need to seek expertise beyond that which we hold ourselves. At times, we develop relationships with those partners, and we start forming our own cultural community within design. It's at that point when we reorient ourselves to the expertise that exists around us that we begin to completely take on a bit more of a communal understanding and focused growth. We call this transdisciplinary design. The results from this, exhibited at Apple's Central Wolf campus or Arctic in Los Angeles, a future high-speed rail station, begin to demonstrate solutions that if you took apart any piece of it, you would lose a part of the whole. What would that curvilinear office complex meant to evoke the landscape look like if you took away those curves? If you took away the lamella form of that railway station that reduces the embodied carbon of its structure by up to 80%, you're left with another square box building. And so we need to leverage our partnerships to better understand how we solve problems. There's another expert that we should be looking at more frequently, and that's nature itself. How do we rely on 3.8 billions of years of evolution and nature's genius to serve as a mentor for the work of what we do? And then when we do that, we begin to create mutualistic prioritization of the core, the environmental systems, with the whole, and that we can all gather ourselves around a very common goal of environmental stewardship. And so regenerative design engages the continuous and healthy relationships of the environment, building, and people. It enhances a site's ecosystem performance beyond that of the native habitat. Put very simply, regenerative design brings new life to something that has been depleted. It takes every decision and action and focuses it corely in on what would be best for nature. It puts life at the center. Over the course of the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to talk around three sort of recurring topics. I want to get you all to be engaged in around a common challenge that we face within urban spheres, issues of resilience. We're going to talk a little bit about biological systems and how they may serve to be a good guide to it. And we're going to talk about design processes. How do we solve those challenges as a company, as a community, or as other more informal organizing entities? And so the first challenge I'll represent is that of what we face today more often than any other point in human history, that more than 1 million people move into cities every week. That's the equivalent of building Hong Kong 7 times over every single year. And so imagine the resource depletion that we have that faces against natural systems as we grow this urban entity. Many of you that are involved here in the climate and sustainability track have no doubt seen some version of this graph. Look at the IPCC reportings on our general trends towards CO2 emissions. That if we follow on a business as usual track, we reach 2 degrees Celsius and beyond and impact a point of unsustainable climate change. If we can amend our behaviors, if we can build in smarter, better ways, we can bring down that curve. And a lot's happened over the course of the past several years. We can be very excited about drawing that down. But what we want to do is go beyond a current target and focus goal of decarbonization or carbon neutrality, a goal of 0, to something that is hopefully more aspirational. And so sustainability becomes a somewhat inadequate term for the work that we're trying to accomplish. If you all that have traveled here to Austin were to go home or go back to your business and your supervisor asked you, what did you learn this week? And you said nothing, you'd get in trouble. If you went to your quarterly board meeting and you asked, what were our profits for this year? And you said 0, you'd probably be fired. We need to move beyond achieving 0 benefits for the environment. And so regenerative design looks to move ourselves from standpoint of purely performing sustainable activities, a point of view of conservation, which we still want to maintain, but to go beyond that, to engage the natural systems to replace artificial ones that we might not need, or that ecosystem services might perform better. At the point in which we begin to have those human and natural systems actively co-evolving as one, that's where we find that parity between the artificial environment and the natural environment, and we're designing for nature and communities begins to join into each other equally. This is an important challenge that we have to face because we're beginning to look at biodiversity also beginning to become depleted around the world. And in order for us to achieve these goals, becomes a really critical piece. The pharmaceuticals that we rely on for our own health, the more systemic storm and climate change events that we see are all being exacerbated because nature isn't able to balance itself. And so biomimicry becomes another interesting piece of this. So moving into number 2, we're going to focus on how biology and natural systems can become this inspiration for us. The goal in biomimicry isn't to simply copy the forms that we find in nature, it's to innovate using nature's principles. And what that means is to actually design with the systems that we find in nature, those that have evolved out of 3.8 billion years of evolution on Earth. And so what that means is beginning to study nature's own R&D labs, understand the ecological processes that exist, how can those be utilized in both industrial applications, in building, but also very directly in the natural environments that we continue to inhabit and that provide us safe haven. We want to find more companies and partners to vet, understand, and emulate those effective strategies and formulate those as prototypes that we can begin to advance forward. We're moving beyond a position of intent to one of evidence-based design in this process. We have for a long time been trying to create additional open space, nature within our cities. We know intuitively that these provide us benefits. But we're now able to, through the assistance of ecologists that have worked for 25 years at Ecometric Solutions Group, as well as artificial intelligence, begin to track the health and life of those natural systems to quantify how nature may evolve. And so the third piece I mentioned is going to be about design and talking about solutions. Our first solution really is a design process that no individual organization can solve all of these problems on their own. And our main partner in this is Biomimicry 3.8, a group that specializes in this biological strategy. HOK is partnered with B3.8 as well as Jacobs to begin to leverage all of the genius skill sets that we have to start working towards common challenges that we find in a group of change agents. And those include companies like Ford, Google, Microsoft, amongst others, that are making commitments not only to environmental stewardship, but to environmental restoration. And in this learning process, working with them to create adaptive laboratories within the environment that allows nature to thrive. And so our positive performance methodology is a fairly simple one. We begin by identifying the local conditions and qualities of place, along with the key goals and requirements that a client may have. We quantify the baseline performance of a site, as well as the ecological performance of a native habitat or a reference healthy habitat if one doesn't exist in the place where we're doing work. From there, we do the part that we really enjoy. We create, we design guidelines and strategies that emulate those ecosystem services and perform to those metrics for which we're measuring ourselves against. The hardest part is number 4, implementation. That's both working as a design team to implement those strategies, but it's really critically important for the client group, a developer, a university, to be committed to the environmental growth that comes with it. When we build a car or an office building, you turn over the keys, it generally works. It needs tuning, but you don't wait for it to change its behavior. Nature takes time to thrive, and we need to provide it time to do so. So to express that in a little more detail, that positive performance methodology begins really by identifying the functional needs that exist between the ecosystem, a client, and a community that need to be served. We look at that ecological performance gap by quantifying it. What does the local site do against that reference healthy habitat? We create design strategies to close the gap, identify those co-benefits that meet the needs, the mutualistic needs of the ecosystem, community, and company. And we work with management to understand how we can operate that long term. We'll begin now to take you on a little bit of a world tour of a number of different resiliency challenges that are commonly experienced and take you through North America, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and back to North America to explore some of the challenges we face and how we've relied on biology to solve them and how we're beginning to identify and track what's being performed with them. So we'll start off with hurricanes and flooding. Around 250,000 people have died over the course of the past 25 years due to flooding, and more than 2.5 billion people have been impacted. Annually, on average, we see about $500 billion of investment impacted by floods. And so beginning in Washington, D.C. at the U.S. Coast Guard headquarters, a 1.2 million square foot office building completed around 2015, we were charged with exploring how to manage the stormwater impacts that would occur across a 450-acre site, most of which is upstream from us or uphill from us, being totally impervious. How can we manage not only the rainwater that fell on our site, but also that was going to be rolling down towards us? When we begin to look at biology, we can find keystone species that solve these challenges. And the beaver is a phenomenal one for this. We'll begin here. Beavers slow down, filter, store, and distribute water. By looking at the collection of dams that they begin to distribute, you begin to understand a purification process that can happen. We can do this by looking at soils, by looking at the terracing of buildings. And so how can we translate what nature's design and nature's genius is, this very simple series of upstream barriers to slow water, into a design principle that echoes that very similarly? It's not as simple to simply create a bunch of cascading roofs. You'd have a lot of water flow runoff to it. Our watershed is pretty significant. We wanted to design a campus that would function as well as the forest to the north and south of us. Our main campus, located here, is that 1.2 million square foot U.S. Coast Guard headquarters building, receives the water from upstream as well as down below. And so beginning to create that terracing scape allowed us to look at the total quantity of water we would need to manage on site. We began to look not only at the context of the beaver, but the context in which we lived, from 5 different ecotones, from the Piedmont Mountains to the Rocky Piedmont Plains, out to the southeastern coast and the mid-Atlantic coastside. By exploring these different landscape species, we began to understand different soil contexts, different species that we could propagate across this site, and developed a vision for the project. How could we utilize it to service as this stair-stepping process? The resultant nearly 500,000 square foot green roof is one of the largest in North America. It manages approximately 500,000 gallons of water each year. More unique than what is the beauty of what we see here is how the ecology around the site has responded. One of the unique maintenance challenges is that we have deer migrating across our site. A bald eagle's nest has formulated on the administrative building as you welcome into the site, and the camera features that commonly. We've replanted trees, and the ambient temperature of the zone is much lower than the rest of Washington, D.C. Each of the 5 different ecozones that we looked at as inspiration of soils became different courtyards that we see cascading down through this. What that creates for our frontline workers is a really calming environment for people that work in very stressful jobs. They get to look down on these terraces, looking out towards the Anacostia River, and experience that beauty. Within the interior environment, you can begin to see, even from the child care center, the connections that every different office environment has back out to nature, and inviting you into these different courtyards with different representative characteristics. Water has its own story and experience. As it cascades down each of these different roofs, it funnels through different landscape features, allowing you to experience and watch water, especially after a storm, move through these different zones in really unique ways. Ultimately, all of the water that comes down across this building formulates into a central weir, essentially an artificial wetland. All of the water that collects here is reprocessed through and filtered naturally up to the top of the building and allows for all of its non-potable landscape irrigation around the year, and creates an opportunity to begin for that watershed that we've experienced uphill to be cleansed, and that as we release our water downstream and into the Anacostia River to be slowly purified. And so take that as a moment of consideration. Well, this is one campus. Imagine if we began to manage all of the stormwater that collected on our site and work to actually funnel that and better the communities around us. From the mid-Atlantic of the US, where we have water abundance, to Dubai and the UAE, where we deal with water scarcity. I'll take you now to Al Barari, a residential hospitality development outside of the center of Dubai by about 10 minutes. It's here that Al-Barari, best known for its landscape company Greenworks, has created one of the first sustainable hospitality developments in the region. What we deal with in Dubai is what you might expect: temperatures above and beyond 40 degrees Celsius every day of the year, high rises and impervious hardscapes, making the ambient temperature feel like 50 or 60 degrees Celsius. On the site here at Al-Barari, we took inspiration from Al Ain Oasis, a regional oasis which begins to tell us lessons about how we can store water underground and properly recycle and reuse it. Being a site of a landscape company, it was already an oasis, but as it's being converted into a residential development, we're seeing a lot more water use. And so the question became, how can we begin to redistribute that water and also create a more habitable condition and re-explore urban living in Dubai? And so the Greenworks company had, for the longest time, followed fairly sustainable practices for its landscape nurseries. But as we began to look at the conversion of that into mid-rise residential living, we wanted to take all of the water that was being used by the buildings and feed it back into the ground. Allow that to actually propagate through verdant landscape waterways to really bring the landscape to life in the area. Beyond that, in our master planning process, look at natural ventilation and pathway flows, reorientation of the building so we can create a porous landscape that allow these natural breezes to create a calming and comfortable attribute. The ultimate effect shown here at Asjar is a development that is typically 2 to 5 degrees Celsius cooler than we find in downtown Dubai, about 6 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit. So on that typical 40 degrees Celsius day, we're down to around 34 degrees Celsius. A strictly pedestrian-only environment where people are allowed to walk through the spaces in a child-friendly way, explore and learn about the landscape systems. Water is reused about 3 or 4 times before it is funneled back down into the groundwater, using both artificial water reclamation on site and processing, as well as feeding through landscape systems multiple times. The environment allows for a diurnal exchange that allows cooling at night, a release of heat into the night sky, and for the residential living, the architecture itself utilizes a series of cascading terraces and shades that reduce the amount of active cooling that needs to occur on the site. The resultant effect is mostly a sort of beautiful, harmonic environment. Moving from Dubai onwards to Singapore, the Singaporean government around the mid-2010s began focusing in on how could they actually begin to create the highest quality healthcare for a more a public base. And so when we began to work on the first such hospital, first public hospital in Singapore, we looked at the dipterocart forest. It's not only water quantity and quality management that we're looking at here, it's soil quality, it's air transpiration, it's biodiversity that occurs at a multitude of different levels. We began to deepen our understanding of biomimicry by emulating the tree species and branches that occur across this site. And so the most simple move occurred in our medical planning. How do you move ourselves from a typical 6-dorm bed unit in which you feature very little natural light, almost no views, and definitely no natural ventilation, splay it out to enable all of those access ways into it and begin to branch it out across the site, enabling diverse exposures, breeze flows such that you could bring in natural air without the risk of cross-contamination. The resultant bed units provide every individual both privacy as well as communal engagement and their own personal window to view out towards the cascading gardens that follow through. All of the rainwater that falls onto this building feeds into a number of different gardens that are dedicated both to patients, to practitioners, as well as to families. Most notably is that we find that these gardens not only service those people that are coming to the hospital and general needs, they also allow the public a pedestrian environment to avoid walking on the sidewalk where they're going to be exposed to more noxious emissions from the neighboring street. And so we elevate the plane of the hospital to create a new type of communal environment, one that is focused not only on the active measures of dealing with health, but also preventative or even proactive ones. How do you provide the best environment that reinforces a social engagement and betterment of one's own health and quality? Many of the examples that I've illustrated thus far are developments where we see people of means, companies, campuses, building things out. How do we make that practical for all? And so in collaboration with BuildX Studio, based out of Kenya, we began working on the Sachibondo Healthcare Center in rural Zambia. It's here that we found ourselves working in a community in which it took typically more than a day and more than 100 kilometers of travel for anyone to be able to access healthcare. The primary means of focus on the site was a combination of infectious diseases such as tuberculosis, as well as maternity and pediatric care. And so the notion of trying to keep these different groups and department flows both separate but commingled became intentional. We also needed to work in a siloed environment. So how do we design for equity and circularity in that place? And so our regenerative design process, again, identifying the sort of unique ecological characteristics, we began working with BuildX Studio to identify the appropriate means to incorporate medical planning that would avoid that cross-contamination and enable a site that allowed people access to the outside, appropriate functioning of the healthcare system, and an increase in total bed suites for people coming to the site for either form of care. Most notably was the fact that about 80% of the materials here were based on site, and that because we were about 12 hours distance from the nearest builder, we utilized the community for the labor force. So predominant construction materials is rammed earth brick, dried out in the sun, and locally harvested wood. More than half of the labor force was women, all paid at an appropriate market rate. The ultimate resulting construction process taught them new skill sets that were being introduced into the area. So taking the collection of what we had learned over time on some of those larger scale projects and bringing it here and enabling the community to own that process themselves. The resultant healthcare center has been in operations now for about 7 years, and enables really the healthcare of the region to thrive in a space that was much more challenging to find it. We'll conclude our journey, still along the healthcare track, in Palo Alto, California, where Stanford's medical campus has expanded over the course of the past several decades. The hospital has become challenging to unite practitioners, academics, and administrators as the built environment of the School of Medicine has begun to really expand. And so we were given a charge to find not only a space where people could congregate as one, but how can we create an environment where an individual left better than when they arrived? For here, we were lucky enough to be located adjacent to Stanford's Arboretum. And so taking over an existing parking lot and looking to rehab that and restore the natural environment. But rather than just simply placing the building adjacent to the Arboretum, the context was how do we actually bring nature into the campus itself? How do we lift the building off the ground and create a new scientific workplace through engagement with nature? The coastal live oak is what we find most commonly in the Arboretum here and teaches us a number of key lessons about ecosystem engineering. Coastal oaks are microhabitats. Their root structure pulls in water from afar. Its canopy exists as far out as its roots do and enables a evapotranspiration effect that creates conditions that are appropriate for a diversity of different species. By looking at that sort of distilling patterns of light, promotion of breeze, funneling of water through, we began to ask ourselves, could we engineer the exterior environment to be as comfortable outdoors as it would be indoors? And so rather than blurring the boundaries between the indoors and outdoors, could we break them open completely? Rather than building a less embodied carbon building through materiality, how do we build a smaller building? And so 20% of the building's program is built outdoors. And so before we begin optimizing our structures, we've eliminated 20% of our carbon. We follow through that natural placemaking effect, incorporating passive solar design, natural ventilation, connection to the nature, but also enabling the community to come through, which is a difficult thing for any academic campus. There is a perceived wall of separation. And so with the parking lot previously, it wasn't known that you could really move into the Arboretum. Now the building serves as a phenomenal gateway to allow that equitable access of local residents into it. For those people that work inside the building, long hours or coming in after an 8-hour surgery at all hours of night, we created the same reference materials, patterns, and textures that we found in the Arboretum into the building itself. And began to terrace through the building, began trying to create the experience of the Arboretum ground, the understory, canopy, as well as views out to the sky. As I noted at the beginning of this, ecometric intelligence has become a really important piece of our puzzle. How do we begin to not only intend to improve environmental quality, but how do we measure ourselves and keep us true to it? And so by looking at what we find and quantifying nature's benefits, we can see a native habitat. When we carve a road through that ecological node, we don't reduce it by 1/3. We sometimes reduce it by 2/3 because we've disconnected the most important pieces of a natural flow. By beginning to look at our same development site and looking at that area cover of moderate tree cover and patches of grassland, we begin to start looking at a graph that isn't talking about a drawdown, but an upcycle. And so our mountain climbers are about taking that parking lot, engaging the arboretum, building a building that expands and moves beyond its benefits. And so on the far right, you see that of the ecological health before development. Our building begins to move towards it, but it doesn't quite fulfill the whole picture. There's still work to be done. If we were to engage a green roof in there, incorporate more natural systems in the process, you begin to see that gap close. And that's the journey that we're going to be on for the next 25 years together. Not exploring carbon neutral buildings, but net positive buildings, net positive developments and benefits towards the overall community. And so as you come to Stanford along Quarry Road, you see that gateway. You have summer gardens that provide passive cooling and shade from the sun. During the wintertime, you're exposed to sun and shaded from the breeze. And throughout spring and fall, public or private academics are able to engage in many of the balconies that lay across the arboretum. And as the arboretum begins to move into the campus, we start seeing the ecological connections begin to reform that had been lost before. Beyond what I've been able to show you through the work that we've done exploring development within the built environment, there are issues beyond. Those that exist within agriculture that continue to deplete resources through following a fairly simple crop-based cycle. We want to explore more of those same regenerative system flows that we see occurring within agroecology, to begin to look at permaculture, to create better uses that incorporate and enhance soil health, water flows, air quality, biodiversity, human health and well-being, as well as carbon sequestration. And that's where it becomes really important for us to get out of our silos, for us to ask questions that go beyond what we're expected to understand or what we're tasked or trained to know, to rely on each other in a very new and dynamic way. As we begin to face and continue to face, I think, some of the evolving circumstances of climate change, the forest fires that happened within the Bay Area 5 years ago that we saw just in the past few weeks in Los Angeles and around, we see the decimation that can occur. That's not alone to what we experience here. It occurs in tornadoes in the center of the country, hurricanes all across the East Coast, earthquakes in rural parts of Asia, and all around the world. We want to look and to understand how we can incorporate all of the different ecological flows of the forever wild, those natural processes and systems, and bring those into the places where we live to enhance those environments. And while I know artificial intelligence is a very big theme of the conference here this week, we also need to be very conscious of the externality that comes with the data centers that are expanding out as a result of that. That everything we do on our smart devices, the presentation that'll be placed online afterwards, this, are all drawing from the natural resources that we're excited to engage ourselves in. How do we learn from this and begin to start thinking through different system flows? Because if we don't, we see the worst case projections that by the end of this year, data centers may consume 25% of all electricity globally. And when we see that, we start seeing a drawdown that can't be sustained. And so if we want to have a more self-generating experience, we want to look to a data center that perhaps looks more like a winery than it does a big box shed. How do we engage it within the ecology? How do we take the water consumption, feed it back into the ground, daylight creeks, incorporate it through more soil-based living, mass timber systems that enable biodiversity to thrive and coexist and interact with the technological systems that are there. These systems aren't easy, and we don't have a perfect method of doing this yet. We need collaboration across industries and across disciplines. Thank you. Happy to welcome any questions from all. Yeah, that's a great question. I think the number one thing we need is, more time. The biggest barrier that we face on projects is that people want to move fast. Impatience is the number one reason I think we have the most of the environmental issues that we have today. And so the more that we have these sort of aligned partnerships to understand those challenges, to begin to take on more of this evidence-based practice, the better. The other one is the sort of economic backing, that not only commitments of finances to these projects, but an understanding of the sort of natural capital. And so understanding what ecosystem services can do to offset the costs that often lead to developers or contractors avoiding the incorporation of those systems.
Okay, thank you for that presentation. Those were beautiful examples. In the beginning, you talked about how your firm has been doing this for a long time, and you're starting to focus more around environmental justice and more focus on the communities. And you've mentioned it yourself, like a lot of these examples are organizations of means. Like the Stanford example is so gorgeous. I'm from the Bay Area, and I know right next to it, East Palo Alto has way fewer trees, and those communities could probably really benefit from a lot of this regenerative design. So I'm just curious, like, how are you seeing that evolve within HOK, or really just the industry in general, being able to integrate more environmental justice?
It's a great point. I'd say that around 2011-12, I co-founded HOK Impact with a number of other, at that point, young colleagues that are really interested in looking at how could we not only design for the 1%, but also for the 99%. And that evolved into sort of three different areas of focus: pro bono design work, fundraising, and just pure community action. How do we engage with them? One of the best examples we have in the Bay Area began out of community engagement in Bayview, which is one of the most economically challenged areas within the Bay Area. There are a number of small landscape projects being done there, participatory design engagement with the community. They design solutions that we help guide them through. We ultimately created a new gateway to that center, building large structural letters, but they mosaic them themselves. And so when we think about design as a participatory process, we begin to not only start quieting our own expertise, but listening to what the needs of others are. And that becomes one of the first big pieces, that it creates confidence and pride in the communities that become engaged. They feel empowered to be part of that process. And I think that's one of the things that we want to be doing more of. Yeah.
Hey there. So I've spent the last 10 plus years here in Austin working on urban infill, which is 10 years ago is kind of like bad word. And now I feel like people are really wanting to pull back into the cities and walkable spaces. And I think it's getting a little bit more of a boost.
Yeah.
Spent a lot of time saving trees, building water quality ponds, and doing things to minimize that impact of development. But then I drive around and I see new projects, and they're just big boxes. And not every project can get the kind of HOK treatment, right? So how would you suggest getting, like you said, you need more time. Like, how do you suggest getting some of these things in the hands of those developers that maybe don't know that they can do certain things to improve and get towards that direction without having to lose that bottom line?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, not every one of the developers that I showed here began with a commitment to doing an environmental impact. There were things that came along the way because we advocated for it. In the same way, in the community meetings that developers have to go in front of, showing opportunities that can be done. Working with regulatory bodies here in Austin and others that focus on resilience to say, let's build in natural ecosystem services into our building codes. Work with the developers that are engaged in this, because there are those that are, and try and help them broadcast that message. And that's where a designer, a developer may not always be the best storyteller. Sometimes you need to find the right community group, or even marketing and communications company that elevates that story, that brings it to bear more consistently. And so while I've been able to share a number of transformational examples, right, we all want to see these happen all the time. And I think that's a two-part piece of people have to want to do it. Regulations will raise us up, but people will fight them if they aren't interested in it. And it's always, I think, a key thing to sell a vision of optimism rather than trying to tax someone against it, right? I think that's a huge piece to it. Yeah.
Hi, probably a pretty similar question, but I was just wondering how these projects are selected. It seems like healthcare centers are kind of the main candidates, at least from what we saw today. But it seems like data centers, that was also a really cool visual, but the data centers and manufacturing plants would be excellent candidates for these sort of designs. And I was just kind of curious if it's just an appetite on their end, or yeah.
I can say that we are doing a lot of work within the industry sphere, and unfortunately, I'm not allowed to comment too heavily on them. And I'll also say I wish I could, and I wish that was part of some of those projects, but I can say with some confidence, there's exploration there. I think that there are still challenges to face, because whenever you do an individual building, like a hospital or an office or a school, the economics involved in it are much less than when you build a whole new automotive manufacturing site, when you build a data center. But when those happen as well, the NIMBYism involved in it increases as well. And so our big prospect in selling that is to say that, if you can create jobs, if you can improve environmental systems and factors by developing a site, your time lapse from design input to permit is going to be improved. Because if the community wants you there, because your data center is something that they want to see, right? You're that much more likely to go to market faster, which means those companies are able to make money sooner. So it's not revenue loss, it's revenue gain sooner. I think that's one of the big attributes that we're trying to build into the story of the economic model of it. Yeah, you're welcome.
As you're raising awareness of some of the environmental justice activities that you do, how do you engage communities to bring awareness of these materials and how they can benefit different communities?
The number one thing we should be doing is engaging with community partners. As a large global firm, we operate around the world. We're not always the expert locally, and we need to recognize that. And so actually finding a local advocacy group that we often partner with to go out into the community to understand how would a new stadium, hospital, or airport begin to impact the local populace. How do we engage them in the appropriate means of design so that they feel part of that process? And so that really begins by just asking smart questions and aligning ourselves with the people that are invested in that first and foremost, and so that we become engaged in that in a quick iterative process. And it's finding the best means possible to enable them to have a voice. Yeah. I'll go start here and go left. Please.
Thank you for sharing your work. It's very cool. One of the questions is, once you deliver the project, how do you keep up with its performance? Is it net zero or net positive?
Yeah, so from the net zero energy operations standpoint, we're able to have a building management system within the engineering systems of that building, meters on our renewable energy systems to understand if our consumption and our generation are meeting. That's fairly established now over the course of the past 15 years. Net zero energy has really been a key thing. We do that now through what we call digital twins, right? Essentially a digital version of the building that we can look at, monitor, and fine-tune that building. When we start talking about the ecology, we've just begun measuring and modeling natural systems. And for those of you that work in any energy modeling, you know that the hardest thing to predict in an energy model is people. Well, soil and worms and birds aren't that predictable either. And so one of the key things within the ecological modeling that we're still investigating and looking to see how that's going to evolve through our partners at EMX is, how do we track the health of a tree canopy that grows? How do we track biodiversity that comes to it? There are definitely ways to do that with feet on the ground measurements. The U.S. Coast Guard headquarters site, we have the University of Maryland did a very detailed post-occupancy evaluation about 3 years after it. And so we have detailed understandings of it, but we're not going to get that all the time. And so the question we hopefully have is that we start seeing, once we've created these digital models of the landscape using GIS-based aerial maps, as those satellite images pass through a year, 2, 3 years later, might they be able to be automatically updated around the different landscape characteristics that evolve or don't thrive as well? That won't give us a full comprehension, but that gets us to a really solid basis of understanding. Yeah.
My daughter is studying spatial design with the focus of sustainability. This is exactly what she would love to do. Any advice you can give to a young person like that and what to do to prepare for a career in this space?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want to work in this space, you have to think through multiple different lenses, right? I came out as an architect. I've got a little bit of engineering. I've kind of learned biomimicry and ecology on the side. So getting yourself diversified into it is really important. And sometimes that means, we're often hiring folks for full-time jobs, but it's also, regardless of what job you have at that moment, right, becoming an expert in that portion and looking to see what research you can do along the way. None of the work that I showed here was sort of given to us, right? We had to become experts in what we already knew and kept learning and evolving something new. We kept thinking about what's the next layer of this onion we want to unpeel. What's so exciting about education today is that it is so cross-disciplinary, which was not the case 25 years ago when I was finishing studying. And so I think there's a real hopeful expectation in this next generation that they're going to come out of school asking smarter questions than we may have previously. Yeah. Please.
A lot of what you're talking about is, again, not human-centered design.
So it's not.
Or not human-centered design. Rest of the regenerative whole system.
Yeah.
There's a panel here talking about that. How do you think about adoption within HOK? I know you mentioned.
Yeah. So I'd say I didn't focus on the human-centered design elements of these projects. Actually, a phenomenal colleague, Kay Sargent, spoke yesterday or 2 days ago, and she was focusing in on neuro-inclusion. How do we design the interiors of these buildings to allow for different experiences, people that understand and experience different spaces? People want to work in different ways. How do we assist with the return to office? And so our teams are really diversified. What becomes really interesting is what's the major focal point of any project, and they're normally multiple. In the last case of the Stanford project, right, that was really driven by how do you create an environment that would help empower collaboration and sort of casual encounters that would enable people to begin talking when they're normally siloed. And so what was interesting with that one was by looking at taking a very scientific approach to the profiles of people in those environments. When and where would they be most likely to pass through these spaces? The most fascinating compliment that we got out of this project was trying to not only climatically tune spaces outdoors, was what's the success of it? Do people gather in those environments? And as that building opened up midst of the pandemic, we found a populace that was skeptical of returning to an interior office place. And so they enjoyed the balcony more than the conference room. And as they have grand rounds in a big interior conference space, they often break out for their discussions and pull out chairs outside of the cafe to talk. And so that's where we start seeing that we're not only designing for ecology, we're designing for people. My focus might be one way, but I've got a lot of great partners thinking about the other parts too. All the way in the back.
A question about your project and
yeah.
based on an assumption, but if the financing came from the actual topic and then actually regenerative, and how does that impact the model in terms of beginning to pass certain
So the Al-Barari family in Dubai, it was one of the earliest and now longest running landscape companies in the Middle East. So that's where their budget and financing actually comes from. What they did, and not untypical of others within the Middle East, was that they were lucky to acquire a oasis-style site. And as the Greenworks began to build out, they did a really good job of managing their water resources as is. But as their services expanded, they found other sites around the Middle East where they could also engage those landscape, the landscape nurseries. And so as they began looking at conversion, they were sort of trying to sustainably harvest landscape systems there, and now trying to explore a different way of looking at hospitality in the Middle East. So, yeah. Oh, again.
As the director of Regenerative Design at HOK, as you inform all global projects, curious to understand how the studios work and what
So HOK has 25 offices globally and about 1,600 staff. So I personally do not advise every single project. We have a team of about 23 sustainability and regenerative design specialists across the firm who get brought into projects. It's not a perfect system, but I'd say the majority of our projects, especially those along the West Coast, we get brought in the first phase of design. We follow the framework for design excellence as outlined by the American Institute of Architects to try and really unpack what are the opportunities and challenges that a project may face. We take that on as an organization and ensure that there is a roadmap for its integration across the project. Not every project goes in the same way. We have clients that say, not interested. And we have to unpack ourselves the language that we use. Talking about regeneration, sustainability may not land the same way as we can save you $100,000 a year in energy operations, which might all of a sudden unpack a different way to a different audience. So we definitely try and position the work that we do to try and design for the value set of our clients, right? We definitely advocate for these goals within our practice, but ultimately we're here to service our clients, and we need to figure out what are the mutualisms that exist between what they're trying to develop, what we're trying to accomplish through our design practice, and what may impact the community adjacent. Yeah, please. We have time.
Does this work also align with agribusiness or agribusiness, where you've got sort of agriculture in the middle of this
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, I think there are a number of really great examples. I didn't share Eskenazi Hospital in Indianapolis, where we have a landscape garden on the rooftop of that hospital, which allows both the practitioners as well as the patients to go out into that as part of their recovery process to actually be involved in garden beds. For the CalSTRS, which is the largest insurer within the state of California for California state office workers, we have a community garden outside of their cafe. And so a regular office worker can go down into those gardens and do work. I think a lot of it does come down to trying to reinvestigate what is our journey in a given day, and what are different ways for us to interact with each other. Back in a previous role, we built I think the world's tallest rooftop farm on the rooftop of the Bank of America Tower in Hong Kong. Yeah. Alrighty. I think we got time for one more question. Yep.
You build data centers and then